I always struggled with reading and spelling and writing. Always. It was a real struggle and quite traumatic for me as a kid. You know, I remember that sense of humiliation. I'm getting emotional even now, and it's like 50 years later. So this is stuff that really sits with you. You know what I mean? As a kid. And when I think about kids now, part of why I tutor is to kind of help them not go through the really tough time that I went through. But I kind of think back on my childhood and school, and it was horrible. The whole experience for me wasn't a good experience. And particularly living with ADHD on top of that, you know, the trouble you get into and so on, that negative self-image you can create. So it was very, very, very difficult growing up. And I think that helps me as a tutor and an interventionist, because I think if you don't live with those difficulties, it's a little bit difficult to understand just how hard it is.
Welcome to the ADHD Families Podcast. I'm your host, Sharon Collon, an award-winning credentialed ADHD coach and consultant and mama and wife to a very ADHD family. I am seriously obsessed with making life easier for people with ADHD and those that support them. My business, The Functional Family, provides life-changing support and strategies for ADHD. I particularly love anything that saves time, decreases conflict, and creates space for fun. Do you want a life with your beautiful family that is more functional, fun, and full of joy? Let's explore together the wonderful and sometimes wacky world of family life with ADHD in the mix. Did you know that our beautiful humans with ADHD are much more likely to also have dyslexia, dysgraphia, or dyscalculia? And it can be one of those tricky things to navigate. To support us in this space, I've brought in the incredible Michael Shanahan. He is a specialist in literacy and maths intervention, working with students with the 3Ds who also may have ADHD or autism or any other different neurodivergent conditions. He is also the host of Dyscastia, a podcast for parents and educators about the best way to support our kids navigating learning difficulties. In this podcast, Michael really breaks down what the 3Ds are and key practical strategies for navigating this as a family when you have people in your family that have this co-occurring condition. Michael also discloses his personal journey of navigating this and really lets us in on what it's like, especially as a child as he was going through school, navigating his own ADHD, dysgraphia, and dyslexia. It is full of beautiful insight in this podcast, and I can't wait to share it with you. Welcome, Michael. I am so excited to have you on the podcast today.
It's brilliant to meet you finally in person after emailing and listening to your podcast myself.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so I know today's chat is going to be so valuable for our gorgeous listeners. But before I get too excited and ask all my questions, I would love for you to tell our gorgeous community a little bit about you and what it is that you do.
Yeah, sure. I work as a specialist intervention tutor for students mostly that live with learning difficulties like dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia. So I work at home. I'm in my office now. And really, I don't do kind of tutoring like you would do school homework help. Really, I do like an intervention program, usually working with kids that really, really struggle. So, you know, students for whom school is too hard and they can't keep up. So I generally would be teaching reading, writing, or maths, or sometimes all of those to students. My background is as a teacher. So I initially trained as a teacher, secondary teacher, but quite unrelated. So physical education, drama and science were my teaching degree. So really nothing to do with literacy, which is probably because I live with dyslexia myself and ADHD and dysgraphia. So I've always found it really difficult and have strangely ended up doing the thing that I find hardest.
I would love if we could start off by talking about the 3Ds. Now, I've heard you do this on your podcast, but I'd really like for our beautiful community to understand what the 3Ds are.
Yeah, so the 3Ds are dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia. And so in order, if we think of dyslexia first, which is probably the one that's most commonly known by people. And really that's difficulty with reading. And, there are some kind of core deficits. I won't get too much into the detail, but, kind of the core difficulty with dyslexia is this thing called phonological awareness or phonological core deficit. And phonological just means sound. And so people living with dyslexia find it really difficult to hear the sounds in speech and break them up in their head. And when they can, it's then very difficult to manipulate them, to keep a hold of them. So if you think of that and think of a word like, say, cat, which is a simple word, and when we say it, we don't make three different sounds, do we? It's just one blob of sound that comes out, cat. And then when we're reading, what we need to do is artificially break that up into three separate sounds. We've got to be able to break that up into k, a, t. And if you live with dyslexia, that's actually really difficult. And you often hear kids not hearing cat, but they might hear bat or vat or kit. So they don't quite necessarily process those sounds correctly. And then once those sounds are in your head, it's difficult then to manipulate them and think, okay, well, what letter goes with that k sound? Making that link is difficult in your head and often slow. And so you can imagine that if you're having this kind of processing difficulty and, you can eventually get there, but by the time your brain has kind of processed those sounds, matched them up with the letters, it's kind of taken too long to be reading fluently. And so you end up having students that really kind of struggle to read fluently or fast, struggle to keep up with the rest of the class. And then often they form a kind of a guessing habit, and you see them end up reading words that aren't there, or they kind of see the first three letters and make up the rest of the word. So and then that makes it all harder again. So it's really quite a complex problem caused in most cases by, a fairly kind of simple thing, the ability to process those speech sounds and manipulate them and play with them. So that's kind of the core basis of dyslexia, and it makes reading really difficult. And you can imagine if all that processing is going on, it's also very tiring. For a lot of kids, it's a bit humiliating and embarrassing when you're reading and you're struggling so much and you're slow and you're getting it wrong, particularly if you're doing it in front of the class. So that's dyslexia, and we're all fairly familiar with that. And then dysgraphia is kind of related to dyslexia. You can live with dysgraphia and not dyslexia and vice versa, although you do often see them together. And dysgraphia is difficulty with handwriting, not just the physical act of handwriting, but also the ability to kind of formulate ideas on paper. So I live with dysgraphia, and it's kind of difficult to explain, but, if I'm speaking to you now, I can put a story together, I can kind of see the structure in my head, and I can make sense, hopefully, most of the time. Sometimes I don't. But when I put it on paper, I don't know what it is. I just can't do it. You know what I mean? It's just really, really hard to put those ideas onto paper. Some of it's because the actual act of writing is difficult. So the physical act of forming the letters kind of takes up so much of your brain power that there's not much left over to keep the ideas in your head and keep the flow going and keep the structure going. Because when I'm talking, I can go at a pace, that my brain can keep up with, particularly if you live with ADHD and your brain's going super fast. Imagine if your handwriting is really slow and laborious, by the time you've written the first word, your brain's moved on, hasn't it? And, it's on to the next 3-4 things you're thinking about. And to try and drag it back and get that idea onto the page, that's really tricky. People living with dysgraphia also really struggle with spelling. And you can see why. A lot of it is because that act of handwriting is so difficult and takes up so much brain power that there's not much left over for the processing and working out which letter goes where. There are different kind of reasons behind dysgraphia. Sometimes it's just simply like a physical motor issue, kind of that fine motor control. I mean, I personally live with really small fingers. This thing called brachydactyly, it's like a genetic condition that makes my fingers really small. And unfortunately, I cut my half my thumb off as well in a motorbike accident. And so handwriting has always been physically difficult for me. Forming the letters, having that pencil control. And so that takes up a big chunk of brain power while I'm writing. And it just leaves not much left for the spelling and the comprehension and keeping a thread of the story and so on. So, yeah, dysgraphia really is not a huge amount of awareness around it. I often hear people say handwriting's not important anymore. I really disagree with that. As someone who lives with dysgraphia myself, you have to actually write all the time. You know, you can't 100% live in a computer, and it has a big impact on your confidence, you know, spelling and handwriting, because it's very public. You can kind of hide a learning difficulty. You know, you can mouth the words with the other kids in the class or, you know, not read. But as soon as you put something on paper, everyone can see it, including you. So it's actually quite, you know, embarrassing and humiliating, that whole handwriting thing. And unfortunately, people do kind of judge you on your ability to spell and your handwriting. So yeah, that's a tricky one. So that's dysgraphia. So we've got dyslexia, dysgraphia. And then the other D is dyscalculia, a little bit like dyslexia, but for numbers. So it's a lack of or a difficulty with number sense. Dyscalculia is probably 20 years behind dyslexia as far as research goes. There isn't even kind of a standard test that you could do or a standard assessment to say this is dyscalculia, or even a standard set of criteria for it. So it's way behind in the literature, you know, and the research, which is a bit odd considering how important maths is. You know, we're always talking about maths and literacy as being important. And it's a really, you know, if we're talking about dyslexia, the core difficulty there is that kind of sound awareness, working with sounds. With dyscalculia, the core difficulty is size and quantity. You know, being able to instantly know that that's bigger than that, or this amount is more than that. So one of the kind of assessments that you do when you're evaluating someone is show them random dots on a piece of paper, you know, a card with random dots on it, or I like scatter beans on the table and they have to estimate how many's there. They find that really difficult to go, this has got more than that. Now, obviously they can do it. Just like with dyslexia, you can read, but it's really slow and hard work and not automatic. So that kind of core difference there then makes everything to do with numbers hard. So if you don't have that kind of clear picture, or you can't quickly discern bigger and smaller, then things that are fundamental to maths, like a number line, people living with dyscalculia don't really have a good mental picture of a number line. You know, when you say, think of a number line, you know, with 0 to 100, and you say, where would 70 sit? They have a lot of trouble going, oh, that's, you know, kind of nearly 3/4. You know, they can do it, but it takes that extra processing time. And so if that kind of stuff is not automatic, then when you get to the really kind of much more conceptual parts of maths, you know, now that numbers are represented by these squiggles on a page and all these symbols and so on, the whole thing gets very confusing. I discriminate the difference between dyscalculia and just kind of difficulty with maths based on the kind of level of difficulty, I think you could say. So my daughter lives with dyscalculia, and I remember, this is the same for students that I tutor, their concept of numbers will be kind of outrageously wrong. You know, so you'll say, okay, what's 10 plus 2? And they'll go 48. And you go, okay, not quite. Let's start. Let's go 10, 11, 12. 10 plus 2 is 12. What's 10 plus 2? 46. So it's like, I don't get it. They don't, like, it's complete non-awareness of numbers and what they mean. And so working with students living with dyscalculia, you kind of have to go right back to the beginning of what are numbers, you know, and do a lot of concrete work with counters and, you know, really trying to fill in that gap of that basic understanding of number and size and quantity. This is bigger than this is bigger than that. They're the 3 Ds. Difficulty reading, difficulty handwriting, difficulty with numbers and maths.
I would love to learn a little bit about your experience growing up, because you've got 2 of the 3 Ds, right? So tell me a little bit about what...
You know, I've never been assessed for dyscalculia, but I suspect that I do live with it as well. I don't find maths easy. I find maths really hard.
I'd love to know a little bit about your journey. So going through school and what it was like for you, because I don't think we've ever had someone on the podcast talk about this from a first-hand perspective.
Yeah, it's interesting because I never thought of myself as living with dyslexia. So I knew I lived with ADHD because right as a kid, I was diagnosed hyperactive, which back then was what they called it. But nothing happened. There was nothing, and there was no consequence of that. And something like dyslexia or dysgraphia, I don't think I'd even ever heard of it or thought of it. I always struggled with reading and spelling and writing. Always. It was a real struggle and quite traumatic for me as a kid. I remember that sense of humiliation. I'm getting emotional even now, and it's like 50 years later. So this is stuff that really sits with you. You know what I mean? As a kid. And when I think about kids now, part of why I tutor is to kind of help them not go through the really tough time that I went through. But I kind of think back on my childhood and school, and it was horrible. The whole experience for me wasn't a good experience. And particularly living with ADHD on top of that, the trouble you get into and so on, that negative self-image you can create. So it was very, very, very difficult growing up. And I think that helps me as a tutor and an interventionist, because I think if you don't live with those difficulties, it's a little bit difficult to understand just how hard it is. And kids are not good at showing their emotions. They cover it up, as a defense, or they don't know how to express it. So it's easy to kind of think they're sailing along. And I was probably a kid like that because I wouldn't want to admit that I was having difficulty, because that'd be weakness or I'd get into trouble or whatever. I was just trying to go under the radar and had a whole lot of strategies for pretending that I knew things. So it was quite tricky. And then in my adult life, when I look back on it, I just did a whole bunch of stuff to avoid ever having to do much reading or writing. A whole lot of things I did to avoid ever having to write in public or spell in public. So there's a whole lot of stuff, and I was doing all of that with no awareness of anything like dyslexia or dysgraphia. And then it wasn't until I had children and my son was diagnosed with dyslexia. So he had a huge amount of trouble learning to read. We went and got an assessment. And I remember during the assessment, the psychologist was explaining dyslexia, and my wife started laughing. And the psychologist said, "Why are you laughing?" And she said, "Because you're describing my husband, not my son." And I'm like, What do you mean? I don't live with dyslexia. And that was kind of the moment for me of like, actually, the more I learn about it, the more I realize, actually, maybe I do. So I ended up getting assessed, and then was also assessed with dysgraphia, which I had never heard of. My journey was really one of kind of personal discovery through my kids. The more I learnt about learning difficulties, the more I realized a lot of the answers for why I'd been struggling. I wish someone had recognized it when I was a kid, because life could have been a whole lot easier, which I suppose is, why I'm here now, why I do this, even though I find it really hard. There's not enough tutors out there. I get phone calls and contacts every week for people looking for tutors, and I'm full up to the brim. And there just aren't people out there. Part of why I do it is because it's needed, because kids don't really get what they need in school in a lot of cases.
So thinking about the link with ADHD, because, if people are listening to this podcast, right, they've got ADHD in their family. Can you tell me what the link is with the 3Ds and ADHD?
It's difficult to get an exact statistic because it depends on the study, but, around, if we average it out, 30-40% of kids that live with ADHD also live with dyslexia, dysgraphia, or dyscalculia. And so it's a pretty good chance, almost a 50-50 chance that if you live with ADHD, you live with one of those 3Ds. And so there's a big crossover there. But it's also a little bit grey, because I think some of the, lack of attention in ADHD, just ADHD on its own, could lead to reading difficulties, writing difficulties, mathematics difficulties, just because paying attention is such a huge part of learning. If you can't pay attention, then you're not going to get the information that you need. You're probably not going to get the practice you need to make it automatic. And so, I suspect that even though, research kind of shows they affect different areas of the brain, I expect that crossover is there because, you can kind of see the link between attention and learning difficulties. And I think sometimes, because testing is not precise, it may be that a student's really struggling with reading and writing, but, how do you tell whether the core reason is because they're not able to pay attention for long enough to learn it, or whether it really is a phonological or, like a sound deficit? So I think there's a little bit of a grey area there. And look, I'm no expert in this, but there's definitely a crossover. And look, as far as I'm concerned day to day, I really do want to know if a child has been assessed, and it's very helpful for me to see their assessment results and, get a picture in my head of where they might be struggling. But ultimately, it doesn't matter, and I tutor kids that have no diagnosis or identification, because ultimately it's just about that kid sitting in front of you and what do they need in that moment. It's very helpful to have the classifications and, know what diagnosis is, but really even two people living with ADHD are not going to be the same, are they? So for me, it comes down to that personal one-on-one relationship, which I can have as a tutor. In a school, that's really tricky. I really feel for teachers that might have 25, 30 kids in front of them and trying to teach it to all those kids at once with all the different needs that those kids might have. It's really tricky. And I think it's often why the kids that live with the 3Ds struggle at school, because, usually it just goes too fast for them. They can't keep up. And so, yeah, I don't know. Does that make sense?
Sure does.
Yeah.
Many parents, they know that something's going on for their child and they're experiencing some additional challenges. Like they've got their ADHD diagnosis and now we've been flagged for one of the 3Ds, and they can start to feel really overwhelmed because, ADHD in itself, like from a pediatrician point of view, has a very clear diagnostic protocol, like a treatment protocol, right? They go through these like standard steps. Now, of course, as an ADHD coach, I will 100% tell you that is not enough. That we need to support executive function skills and develop and in a way that works for that child, which I think you would be very much on the same page as that. But for the parents' point of view, adding another thing in there, they can start to feel really overwhelmed when they get that diagnosis of one of the 3Ds, because it's not as clear cut into what we're going to do about it. So what would you recommend for them right now?
Yeah, I know that because I've been that parent. And, like I said, I never even thought of dyslexia or dyscalculia before my kids were diagnosed. And even though I was a teacher, I knew nothing about it. And you do kind of have that moment of panic of like, I kind of see it as my child's life has flashed before my eyes, and you can't help but think, oh my God, are they going to get a job? Are they going to be able to work? It is very overwhelming, and it's a lot of work for a parent, and I can feel that extra thing, that one extra thing is like, how do I fit this in? I think my primary advice would be to get expert help, particularly if you're new to it all. When I started with this, I've been, heavily involved with learning difficulties and so on for 20-something years now, since my kids were diagnosed. And I'm still learning things. And I still don't feel like I really am a total expert, you know what I mean? And so if you've just received a diagnosis, I think be easy on yourself and don't put an expectation on yourself that you can understand this straight away and solve it straight away. I think it's better to seek expert help and advice. And there's plenty of it out there. There are spelled organisations in each state that are not-for-profit, and they're for parents for exactly this purpose. They run introductory courses. There are people like you who run, information sessions for parents and courses for parents so that you can get up to speed. So I kind of think take a deep breath and go, I think this is going to be okay. It's really hard, and it's going to be hard, but it's going to be okay. And even though you go through really hard times, I think it's, now that my kids are adults and they have jobs and, it's all over, it feels like it was a blink of an eye. But there was certainly plenty of moments in there. And when I say moment, it might actually be 12 months or 6 months where you're thinking, oh my goodness, is this ever going to get any easier? Are we ever going to get through this? But once you are through it and you do get through it, you kind of go, oh boy, they're adults now and it's done. Slow down. You don't have to solve it all right now. You don't have to know everything right now. The first step, I think, would be to reach out to experts and get advice. It's quite tricky, I think, reaching out to social media because you see a lot of conflicting advice there and it can make you even more confused. I often see parents who might, have a new identification for a kid and they ask a question and they get 10 pieces of conflicting advice and the conversation turns into an argument of, no, it's this, no, it's that, no, it's this, no, it's that. I think that's really hard. And so I think going to someone with a level of expertise, whether that's even a GP to start with or spelled or a specialist tutor, I'm happy for people to contact me and just have a chat, you know what I mean? And just get your bearings and go, okay, let's make a plan, do this, do this, do this. I think it's important that a student gets into intervention quickly, even if you don't have an identification. Parents know their kids best. And if you suspect something, I think you don't have to wait to get a diagnosis or get an assessment. You can do something. There are tutors like me or spelled, have tutoring services where they'll match you up with a tutor. And you can get started or even look at online resources yourself and get started. That's a little bit tricky because how do you know what's good and what's not? But yeah, I think getting started quickly, and I think the way you can get started quickly is to seek that expert help, at least at the start, at least till you find your feet, so you don't feel like you've got to do it all alone and, do all the research and find out everything. There's thousands of people that have already done that for you.
And who's in charge of diagnosing the 3Ds?
It varies depending on where you are. And I'm not an expert on, other places, but in South Australia, you would need to be an educational psychologist or a paediatrician. So it can't just be like a standard psychologist or a GP. You have to have an assessment with. Actually, I think in South Australia, speech pathologists can also do it.
Okay. And thinking about the biggest myths or misconceptions about the 3Ds, what are the biggest myths?
Actually, this is quite surprising and it still happens, but I think a really difficult one that often comes up is that they don't exist. You certainly hear that with ADHD as well. I tutor quite a few students who get identified and they tell the classroom teacher and the teacher says, oh, that's nonsense. They just need to try harder. I don't believe in dyslexia, or I've never heard of dyscalculia. You're just making that up. So I think it's not really a myth. There is still a lot of that out there. People that think it doesn't exist, or that the student's lazy, or they're not trying hard enough. And often the result of that can be very damaging, because often the result of that is blaming the kid. So then saying you have to work harder, you have to focus more, you have to do, you could just list, you can imagine it, piling that extra pressure, often leads kids to think they're dumb. A lot of kids, by the time they get to me, unfortunately, they've lost a lot of self-confidence and belief in themselves. And, many of them think they're dumb because they have tried their hardest. They have listened to the teacher and tried their hardest, but it still hasn't worked. And so I think that's quite a tricky one. There's that blanket denial is very difficult to deal with. There are a lot of myths out there. One of the most prevalent ones with dyslexia is that it might be a visual problem. You see kind of vision therapy, and I'm not having a go at vision therapy for someone that has a vision problem, but dyslexia is not a vision problem. Dyslexia is this sound processing phonological deficit. So I'd be wary of those kind of myths. You could kind of go on forever on the myths. I think you can bypass that by talking to an expert and getting expert help from the beginning. And I think by expert help, I mean mainstream. So I know this is a touchy subject with people. And, I know people are a little bit distrustful of the mainstream system or education. But I think as a starting point, that's your safe ground. to go somewhere like Spelled or Understood, which is an excellent online resource, somewhere where you're going to get unbiased, helpful advice as your starting point, rather than straight away, kind of disregarding the mainstream and going for something that's like an instant cure or a miracle or whatever. Or, I think I'd be very wary if you hear people say, this is the secret. Doctors keep this treatment secret because they don't want to lose business. Those kind of scammy things are really tricky to navigate. And so I think talking to someone who has some expertise is a good place to start. Everyone's looking for the silver bullet, right? Like, if this one Facebook thing can calming stickers for ADHD. Yeah. I've got a local lady that's saying that she can heal ADHD in 30 days. Wow. Exactly. But it's designed to catch people when they're vulnerable, right? Exactly. Yeah. It's really sad. It is sad. And so I love that advice. Now, a lot of us on our child, when they've gone and got a diagnosis for ADHD, on that report that the paediatrician will write, it'll say SLD, right? So it will say specific learning disability. What is that, and how does that coincide with the 3 Ds? That is the 3 Ds. Okay. So, yeah, specific learning difficulty is the 3 Ds. I'm old-fashioned and not up with it by calling it dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia. Those terms are not officially used anymore. I still use them because I just think it's too confusing. I mean, we've spent so many years trying to get awareness, and then we throw away the terms that people have got some awareness of. So, yeah, so specific SLD, specific learning difficulty, now they say specific learning difficulty in mathematics, or SLD in handwriting and spelling, or SLD in reading. So if it's an SLD in reading, then it's it used to be called dyslexia. SLD handwriting and spelling used to be called dysgraphia. SLD maths used to be called dyscalculia. Can you tell me a little bit about what tech tools you support or use? I would be wary of software that's claiming to teach kids. So I think there are two categories. There's assistive technology, which I think is incredibly important and helpful. Things like voice to text can be life-changing for a student living with dysgraphia that just can't, get their ideas onto paper, but they can speak. And look, that's just built into Microsoft Word or Google Docs. You can just dictate, and it's really, really good. It used to be so expensive to get programs that let you do that, but now it's just there on, even a cheap laptop. You can use that dictation function. I've seen that have huge impact for students, just the ability to speak and have it right for you. Even programs like Grammarly or Spell Check, I think are fantastic, because my view is that when you're actually working on learning to write or read or spell, then I wouldn't be saying, okay, use Grammarly or voice to text, because that's what we're focusing on. But if my aim is to finish an assignment, then let's just not worry about dyslexia or dysgraphia for now. Let's just get the assignment done. And if that means you're not writing it, or it means I as a parent are scribing for you while you talk, then I think job done. Let's remove that barrier using technology. So there's those kind of technologies which I think are incredibly useful. Other ones that are really common, built both into Google Docs and Microsoft Word, are reading the text to you. I think it's Review Read Aloud is the tool, and then it will just read what's on the page to you. And that is so useful, because honestly, it's such hard work reading when you live with dyslexia. It's really exhausting. So if I can just close my eyes and take a little break and listen to something instead, it's such a relief. And, it's so, I can get so much more done because I don't get so exhausted by having to read something. It's also incredibly good for editing, because living with dyslexia, if I read something, I'm really bad at spotting a spelling mistake or seeing that I've made an error or typed a word twice or whatever. I just don't see it. But if you listen to it, straight away, you can hear, what's that word? That's not, and then you can stop and respell it. So it's really handy for both getting text in and getting text out, by using speaking or listening. So there's those kind of technologies which I think are fantastic for students. I do see programs that claim to teach students, like here, give the student an iPad and send them on their way and they'll learn to read magically through this app or this program. I'm skeptical of that because I think it actually needs expertise. So when I'm sitting with a student, I'm listening to everything they're saying. This is really common. Let's say we're trying to spell the word bench and they're using a V. And I discover actually all their life they've been saying vench, not bench, a V instead of a B. That's why they can't spell this word. But a piece of software is not going to pick that up and be able to correct it with that kind of diagnostic degree. You know what I mean? Or be able to spot that and go, okay, let's spend a couple of lessons on this because, I can see this pattern. A piece of software might be better than nothing, but I don't think it can replace being face-to-face with a person because I can spot when kids are anxious or have stopped paying attention, but a piece of software can't do that. It can't hear when they're not quite saying something right. So I'd be a little bit skeptical of those, especially for maths as well. I know I'm focusing a bit on dyslexia here, but, I see a lot of those maths programs where you learn maths, but I know from personal experience that just doing those kind of maths games is only helpful kind of as practice and repetition. What's really important is the step that comes before that, which is getting them to understand the concept and being able to break it down into tiny, tiny little chunks and really make sure they understand each bit. You could play games as fun, practice, repetition, as a fun way to get repetition. I'd be wary of technology that claims to be able to kind of teach a student, but technology that supports students in doing their work, editing, writing, reading, I'm all for. That's fantastic.
And what about accommodations in the classroom? So parents get a SLD diagnosis for the child. What can they go in and ask for?
It really depends on the student and what the student needs. So usually when you get an assessment, the psychologist will put a whole bunch of recommendations in there. And I think that's a great place to start. And if you get an assessment and you don't get those recommendations, I would ask for them because they're very smart people, with a lot of experience, and they can look at a student's profile and go, I think these are the kind of supports that would, help the student to thrive. And so I think that's a really good starting point. If you don't have that as a starting point, I would be... It's very difficult to say without seeing the student because everybody is different. But kind of some common ones that I think are important is that if you think about, I've been talking about how hard this is for students, especially if you're living with ADHD as well, which is mentally exhausting to maintain that focus. And then add to that, dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia. By the time a kid gets home, they are exhausted. And we've all seen that meltdown that happens. They hold it together all day and they get home to their safe space and just completely fall apart. I think a really good accommodation is around homework because that causes a huge amount of tension because they've got home and they've finally let go and relaxed. And now you're saying to them, okay, now you got to work again. That is torture to make that shift twice and go back into that mode. And so I think de-escalation in that environment, so if your student is, if your kid is really exhausted, is doing a half an hour of homework actually even going to go in anyway? Especially if they don't even want to do it and you're forcing them to do it, it's just going to build a very negative association there with homework and doing that work. And so I think a really good accommodation that would work across the board would be time homework. I mean, first, I think no homework. There isn't even any research to support homework as something effective anyway, from an educational perspective. I think there would be some benefit in developing good habits, because certainly when you get into secondary school, you need to be doing homework because the workload's so huge. And so if you can develop a habit, I think that would be good. And if you think of it in terms of that, then making it something positive, so that it doesn't become this huge bugbear, I think would be good. So with all my students, we had an agreement with the teachers that they would just do 10 minutes. And we would sign off to say, yep, they've done 10 minutes of homework. It wasn't about whether they finished the work or not. It wasn't about get this done by Friday or else, and those kind of raising the stakes. It was just about, yep, they've done their 10 minutes. Tick, they feel good, they've done it. The teacher doesn't hassle them or complain that it hasn't been done. So I think that kind of understanding of the work, the extra work that these students do is probably a primary accommodation, and I think reducing workload overall. So I often see students being given extra time to finish an assignment or finish a piece of work. Now, the problem with that is that they end up having to do way more work than anybody else. Because if it takes Freddie half an hour to do the assignment, but it takes my student 3 hours to do the same thing, and they get given an extra week to finish it, well, they're still doing 6 times the amount of work, aren't they? And then the assignments pile onto each other, and you end up again in that kind of meltdown, high stakes environment again. So I think rather than having extra time to do things, an upfront reduction in workload's really useful. So we often had that agreement with teachers to say, look, these are the 10 questions for homework, just do the first 2. That's it. That's your homework. If you want to do more, go ahead and do it, but you only have to do the first 2, rather than saying you have to do all 10 and I'll give you an extra day to do it. In my experience, that ends up with the parent and the kid staying up till 1 a.m. in a meltdown, full of tears, saying, I have to get this finished, I have to get this finished. The teacher said no excuses. We've been there so many times, and that's really, really unhelpful.
Super bonding. Like, I always just oh my gosh, we just love each other. Like, it's so great. No, absolutely not. Terrible. But I like your strategy of taking the pressure off first.
De-escalate. Because our kids live in such a high state of, often anxiety, but, especially living with ADHD, especially if it's kind of hyperactivity, I'm already wired. I'm already wanting to run around the block or destroy things or jump up and down on the spot, and piling on more and more of that pressure and adrenaline is just going to mean my executive function is completely gone. I'm just in a fight or flight state straight away. And so, I often find de-escalation. The students I tutor, I often just say, hey, relax. There's no pressure here. I don't mind if this takes us the whole lesson to finish this sheet. Just take your time. If you need a break, let me know. So I find that de-escalation is sometimes quite surprising for kids because I don't think they get it. It's usually the opposite. I think because when you see a student not being productive, intuitively you kind of think, I've got to egg them on, I've got to apply more pressure so they'd be more productive. But it's really, counterproductive there, because it's actually that high state that they're in that's causing the lack of production. If you can just tone it down, relax, let's actually make this something we look forward to, something that's fun, enjoyable. Sometimes our 10 minutes of homework wasn't even the schoolwork. It was just something nice, and we call it homework because I want that to be a positive thing, not a horrible, torturous meltdown. You can see a picture of my kids growing up, can't you? And I'm sure it's very familiar to everyone, those high stakes meltdowns. It's really tough, isn't it?
So you mentioned before that your kids are grown up and in jobs now. What would they tell you about their experience with 3Ds?
They found it very difficult, definitely. Everyone's different. My son did stuff, you know what I mean? He was someone that kind of refused accommodations. He was someone that said, I don't want extra time on my test because that's not fair, or I don't need it, or whatever. So he, was of that kind of mindset of, no, I don't want extra time because that's not fair. I see a lot of kids in that mindset of thinking, no, I don't want extra time because that's not fair. My daughter was very strong advocate for herself. And, she would kind of hold the teachers to the plan and say, hold on, you haven't given me my extra time or whatever. So every person's different, isn't it? And they deal with it in a different way. You can't sugarcoat it. School is a really difficult place if you find it difficult to read, because it's all reading, isn't it? And so it's hard, really. And I think as parents, just providing support, knowing that it's hard and kind of recognizing how hard it is. And like I was saying before, that kind of de-escalation. When I say de-escalation, I'm not saying, hey, forget about your homework, don't do it. But let's find a way to do it that's manageable and, doesn't tip you over the edge of it becoming horrible. I'm definitely not saying don't do it, because in fact, they have to do more work than other students. Before you were saying silver bullet, the silver bullet is lots of really hard work. If only it was to, eat lollies and watch Netflix.
I would imagine that. I'd be all over that. Yeah. So tell me how people can find you. Like, tell us about your podcast and what they can do to reach out to you.
Yeah, so I have a podcast, Dyscastia, which you are going to be my next guest, which yes, I'm very excited about.
Show notes as well.
At dyscastia.com. So that's a podcast which really is full of advice for parents and educators about, how to support students living with learning difficulties with as wide a variety of topics as we can. I try and make it a good mix of content for teachers and parents, because I think teachers are a really important part of this and schools are a really important part of it. Schools can make such a gigantic difference and teachers can make such a huge difference for students, as well as parents. So that's the podcast. My tutoring business is called Dyslexic Strengths. And like I said, look, I'm happy to provide support and so on for people, but honestly, I'm not looking for new students to tutor. It breaks my heart to say that, but I've already got so many people on my waiting list. However, on my website, I do have a list of tutors, of specialist tutors, which could be really helpful, both maths and literacy tutors. So to be on that list, they have to have done specialist training in either literacy or maths. There's a level of trust there that if you're contacting someone on that list, they're not just anybody. They're someone who specialises in intervention, literacy or maths intervention. So that's at dyslexicstrengths.com.au. And then I'm a director of another company called Word Cracking, a whole bunch of resources for teaching literacy, particularly focusing on students that struggle the most. So there's some pretty alarming statistics. Students with learning difficulties, if we talk about dyslexia or any learning difficulty, many of them are, don't get specialist intervention. But even those that do, so, the students that go into specialist intervention one-on-one, like I do, 20% of them don't show any improvement. Think about that from the perspective of a student. Imagine thinking, I'm even failing at intervention, really hard for them. And I think, and Sally, the person I work with, from our experience, and Sally's brilliant, she's been doing this for 25 years. Our experience is that sometimes intervention is too hard, particularly if a student lives with intellectual disability or, other difficulties on top of dyslexia or dysgraphia. And so that program is kind of a next level of broken down into simplification. And so it's really designed as a supplement for a standard intervention, specifically designed for teachers or tutors that might have a student that is struggling in intervention. And so it's a whole bunch of resources then to break it down into even finer steps and simplified versions of everything so that students that struggle the most can still get that sense of success, which is so important. And it also has software there for teaching morphology. Don't let me get started on that because we'll be here forever. But, that's a very important part of literacy that traditionally in literacy intervention has been underdone. And, morphology is a huge part of English and the English language and has, for all intents and purposes, kind of been sidelined or ignored in intervention because mostly it focuses on phonics, which is like the letter sound correspondence. But that's not enough. They need to have morphology because it's a huge part of English. And so that's a software and resources around teaching morphology to try and catch people up on incorporating morphology into their teaching. If you're a parent and let's say you don't have a tutor yet, and I know there's a lot of people out there, it still may be useful, even though our resources are designed for teachers and tutors, there's still a lot there that could be useful for parents because the program is so simplified. Even if you don't really understand it yourself, many parents live with learning difficulties themselves. At least getting started and doing something is better than doing nothing. And it's quite inexpensive. It's $144 a year, which for everything that's not very much. That's kind of one session, isn't it? And then you have a year's access to that. There's a training course on there that's included in that to learn about morphology, and kind of step-by-step guides, a whole bunch of worksheets, games, that sort of stuff that you can do with your kids, at least to get started with them until you find a tutor or someone who, is a specialist.
It's been so wonderful having you on the podcast today and also hearing a little bit about your story and the amazing work that you do. So thank you so much for
My pleasure.
Time.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the ADHD Families Podcast. If you loved it, please share it on your socials. I want this to start a conversation about ADHD. If you want to make this mum do a little happy dance, please leave a review on iTunes. If you would like to know more about what we do, check out thefunctionalfamily.com. I truly hope that you enjoyed this podcast and you use it to create a wonderful, effective, joyful life with your beautiful children.